quite a lot during the course about the stages of change that were identified first of all by James Prochaska and Carlo Di Clemente. And you remember they worked with smokers and helping smokers to make um, uh, behavioral changes and to maintain those changes, those health changes. Okay, so here we've got the 5 stages, and I've already explained um, what happens at each of those stages for the individual. Okay, and here's the definition here. So ideally, what we want to do in motivational interviewing, in helping the individual to make changes, is we would act appropriately. If we look at this third column here, application, and what we need to do is to recognize which stage the individual is at. Okay, which one of those 5 stages the individual is at, and then we would use the appropriate application. So for example, where the individual is at the pre-contemplation stage and they're not considering any possibility of change, perhaps they don't feel that there's a problem at the moment, part of our goal in working with them would be to raise awareness of a problem. And again, this is not pointing the finger and directing people and saying, okay, you've got a problem with X, Y, and Z. Okay, what our task here is to just raise awareness in a very compassionate, constructive way, perhaps by using those open-ended questions that we discussed earlier. Okay, we inform and we encourage the individual. We help them to increase their knowledge of risks and validate lack of readiness and say that it's absolutely okay, it's totally understandable to be at the stage where we don't want to make any changes, and we've all been there. Okay. When we feel that the individual has moved on from that to the contemplation stage, where they're perhaps beginning to think about change in the near future, part of our job there in working with them is to help build motivation and confidence, to encourage them at the stage that they're at, to explore any ambivalence. Do you remember we talked about ambivalence, where there's perhaps two ideas around the same issue that are contradictory to each other? And we can also help them to evaluate pros and cons of behavioral change. We could put together a chart perhaps and work through them with it. On the left hand side we'll have a column called the pros of change, and on the right hand side the cons of change. And we'd help the individual to make suggestions and we'd explore those pros and cons. Ideally, hopefully, the person at some point moves on to preparation, where they're making plans to change. They're beginning to set goals for change. Okay. Our task here is to help them to set goals, help them to negotiate a plan, help them to draw a diagram and write down aspects of that plan, to help them facilitate decision making, to help them look at a course of action that's appropriate for them. And again, we're doing this all of the time in a very positive, helpful, constructive way. We're not pushing them or pulling them at all. Remember, we're dancing with them. We're working with them rather than wrestling with them. Okay. When the individual moves on to the action stage, so this is where they're starting to implement action steps. Part of our goal here is to help them to implement the plan, to support their self-awareness, their self-efficacy, to encourage them in their confident way of doing things, to assist them in taking steps towards those changes. Remember, positive feedback is always very constructive for individuals. And finally, maintenance stage. This is where they hopefully maintain those new behaviors that they have identified and implemented, and they're keeping them going. Part of our job is constant encouragement, positive feedback, help them to maintain those changes, the new status quo, and also help them to identify strategies to prevent relapse. Okay, that's the 5 stages of change and how we can, in using motivational interviewing, recognize the stage that the individual is at and then we act appropriately to help them in that stage and ideally help them to move on to the next stage when the time is right for them. Okay, thank you very much. Bye bye.